September 5th, 2014. A single boardroom vote achieved what two world wars and the Great Depression could not. It shattered a 115-year-old American dynasty. With the stroke of a pen, Wall Street activist investors tore the Timken company in half. For over a century, this colossus was the heartbeat of American industry. They forged their own steel and crafted the frictionless bearings that drove Wawutu free. Tanks and Ford assembly lines, sustaining tens of thousands of families. Then, the financial engineers arrived. The mighty roar of integrated steel mills was severed from the bearing plants, leaving a loyal company town bleeding out its legacy. How does an industrial titan that survived a century of global conflict get butchered while still making record profits? The fatal threat wasn't foreign competition or obsolete technology, it was Wall Street greed. Canton, Ohio, 1899 to 2014. What happened here reveals how the soul of American manufacturing was sacrificed to the stock ticker. Before cars ruled the roads, and long before assembly lines dictated the rhythm of American industry, the world moved on heavy wooden carriage wheels. And those wheels had a relentless, invisible enemy: friction. In the late 1890s, every heavy wagon in America was fighting a losing battle against physics. When a loaded horse-drawn carriage turned a sharp corner, the sideways force, known as thrust load, would frequently shatter the axles or strip the wheels right off the wagon. Friction was not just a mechanical inconvenience, it was the ultimate speed limit on human progress. Enter Henry Timken, a highly successful carriage maker in St. Louis, Missouri. Henry understood that whoever could defeat this mechanical resistance would own the future of transportation. In 1899, he patented a solution so elegantly simple, yet so mechanically profound, that it remains an engineering marvel over a century later. He did not merely invent a new bearing, he completely reinvented how the industrial world managed weight and motion. It was called the tapered roller bearing. Traditional ball bearings of the era were perfectly fine for light loads like bicycles, but they cracked under the massive pressure of freight. Henry Timken's stroke of absolute genius was replacing the spherical balls with tapered, cone-shaped rollers. This angled design allowed the bearing to distribute the immense physical stress evenly across a much wider surface area. More importantly, the tapered geometry could simultaneously handle both radial loads, the crushing downward weight of the vehicle, and thrust loads, the aggressive sideways forces generated during high-speed turns. When Henry first tested his invention on a heavily loaded freight wagon, the results defied contemporary belief. The friction was reduced so drastically that 2 horses could effortlessly pull a load that previously required 6. It was a mechanical revelation. Word spread rapidly through the industrial sector. By the turn of the 20th century, a loud gasoline-powered invention called the automobile was beginning to sputter onto American dirt roads. These primitive, heavy machines desperately needed a way to keep their axles from snapping under the strain of motorized torque. Henry Timken quickly realized his bearing was not just meant for horse-drawn carriages. It was the missing biological link for the impending automotive revolution. However, St. Louis was geographically isolated from the rising pulse of heavy manufacturing. To build an empire, the newly formed Timken Roller Bearing Axle Company needed to be closer to the lifeblood of American industry. In 1901, Henry's sons, William and Henry H. Timken, made a strategic, world-altering decision. They packed up their father's patents and relocated the entire operation to a quiet town in northeastern Ohio, Canton. Canton offered a geographical sweet spot. It sat perfectly between the booming, nascent automobile factories of Detroit and the roaring, fire-breathing steel mills of Pittsburgh. The town possessed access to major railroad lines, an abundance of fresh water, and a hungry, hard-working labor force. Almost overnight, Canton transformed from a modest agricultural hub into the epicenter of the global friction management universe. As industrial pioneers, like Henry Ford, began designing vehicles for the masses, they looked directly to Canton, Ohio, to keep their cars rolling on the assembly line. But rapid, explosive expansion brought a terrifying new vulnerability. The tapered roller bearing was, at its core, a precision instrument. To function flawlessly, it required steel of absolute, unyielding purity. At the time, the Timken company had to import specialized steel from Europe or purchase it from fragmented domestic suppliers. The quality, however, was wildly inconsistent. A single microscopic flaw, a tiny air pocket in the steel, could cause a bearing to shatter at high speeds, instantly destroying the company's hard-earned reputation for reliability. When World War I erupted, the supply chain of high-grade European steel completely collapsed. The Timken brothers found themselves standing on the edge of a precipice. They possessed the greatest mechanical design in the world, but they were entirely at the mercy of outside suppliers who could no longer meet their exacting metallurgical standards. It was a fatal bottleneck that threatened to choke the life out of the booming enterprise. The company faced a pivotal existential choice: scale back production and accept manufacturing mediocrity, or take a monumental financial risk to seize control of their own supply chain. They chose the latter. In a move of staggering industrial ambition, the leaders of Timken decided they would no longer beg for good steel. They would forge it themselves. They began constructing their own state-of-the-art steel tube mill and steel-making plant right in Canton. This was not just a simple business expansion. It was the birth of an integrated industrial leviathan. By mastering both the dark art of making the world's toughest alloy steel and the precision engineering of shaping it into frictionless bearings, Timken achieved absolute control over its destiny. They had created an impenetrable fortress of manufacturing. The frictionless dream was fully realized, and the heartbeat of Canton began to pound with the heavy rhythm of industrial dominance. By the 1920s, Canton, Ohio, was no longer just a quiet dot on the Midwestern map. It was the undisputed friction management capital of the world. When the Timken family made the monumental decision to manufacture their own steel, they didn't just solve a lingering supply chain problem. They fundamentally rewrote the rules of American manufacturing. The birth of Timken Steel created a vertically integrated fortress of industry that few companies in history have ever managed to replicate. The logic was brilliantly simple, yet monstrously difficult to execute. Iron ore, carbon, and scrap metal went into one end of the sprawling Canton facility, and perfectly engineered, microscopic tolerance tapered roller bearings came out the other. This level of absolute control over the raw materials meant they could guarantee a standard of quality that no competitor could touch. The skyline of Canton was permanently altered by towering smokestacks, vast rail yards, and the relentless, rhythmic thud of heavy drop forges that shook the ground for miles around. At night, the sky above the city pulsed with the intense orange glow of open hearth furnaces. The company was no longer just making mechanical parts, they were actively forging the skeletal system of the modern industrial age. When the calendar turned to the 1940s and the world plunged into the fiery abyss of the Second World War, the true, terrifying might of this integrated machine was unleashed. The United States military quickly realized that mechanized warfare, tanks, bombers, transport trucks, and naval vessels could not survive a single day on the battlefield without highly durable bearings. A Sherman tank with a shattered axle was just a stationary steel coffin waiting to be destroyed. Timken shifted into a gear the world had never seen. The Canton plants operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, stopping only for shift changes and critical maintenance. They churned out millions of heavy-duty bearings for the Allied war effort. Timken bearings were into the axles of the Willys Jeep storming the beaches of Normandy. They were in the critical engine components of the B-17 flying fortresses roaring through the flak-filled skies over Europe. They stabilized the gun turrets on naval destroyers in the Pacific. The sheer volume of wartime production was staggering, stretching the physical limits of both the machines and the men who operated them. The workers of Canton, many of them, women who had stepped in while their husbands fought overseas, knew they were not just cutting steel, they were actively fighting a global war from the factory floor. They were the indispensable muscle behind America's arsenal of democracy. But the story of Timken during its golden era was not just about the cold, hard metrics of industrial output or the triumphant victory of World War II. It was a deeply human story about the creation and sustenance of the American middle class. Canton and Timken became entirely indistinguishable from one another, bound together in a profound, symbiotic relationship that defined the region for multiple generations. The Timken family did not just extract labor from the town. They poured their immense wealth back into its civic foundation. They funded the construction of Mercy Hospital, built state-of-the-art high schools, and established vast, manicured public parks for the workers to enjoy on their days off. They sponsored local baseball leagues, funded college scholarships, and practically bankrolled the city's infrastructure. If you lived in Canton, Ohio, Timken was the gravitational center of your universe, whether you worked on the factory floor or not. Inside the plant, a unique culture of multi-generational loyalty took root. It was common, expected even, to see 3 or 4 generations of a single family working at the Timken facility simultaneously. A grandfather might operate the blistering hot steel furnace, his son might run the precision grinding machines in a climate-controlled room, and the teenage grandson would be sweeping the floors of the shipping department, patiently waiting for his chance to bid on a union job and move up the line. A job at Timken meant a guaranteed ticket to the American dream. It provided a wage that could buy a house with a front lawn, put a new Ford in the driveway, send kids to college, and guarantee a secure, comfortable retirement. It was an unwritten social contract, sealed with sweat, molten steel, and mutual respect. The company took care of its people from cradle to grave, and in return, the people gave the company their absolute, unquestioning loyalty. They were a family. Through the 1950s and 1960s, the company rode the post-war economic boom to dizzying, unprecedented heights. They held a virtual global monopoly on high-quality tapered roller bearings. Money flowed into Canton like a never-ending river. However, absolute dominance often breeds a dangerous byproduct: absolute certainty. As the decades rolled on, a quiet, almost imperceptible arrogance began to settle over the executive boardrooms and the union halls alike. The empire became comfortable. They believed that because they had built the modern industrial world, the world would always need them exactly as they were. They assumed that the Timken way was the only way, and that their integrated fortress in Ohio was completely immune to the shifting winds of global economics. They were the undisputed kings of American industry, and kings rarely look down to see the microscopic cracks forming in their own foundation. But beyond the borders of Canton, a new era was quietly being forged. Across the Pacific and across the Atlantic, nations that had been reduced to rubble were rebuilding their factories, and they were learning how to make steel and bearings cheaper, faster, and with a terrifying new efficiency. The fortress of Canton was about to be tested, and the Golden Age was standing entirely unaware on the edge of a cliff. By the dawn of the 1970s, the mighty industrial fortress of Canton, Ohio, seemed as invincible as the steel it forged. The Timken Company had spent the better part of a century building an empire on the premise of absolute self-reliance. They owned the mills, they owned the patents, and they commanded the global market. But empires, no matter how heavily fortified, rarely fall to a sudden, overwhelming attack. they usually begin to crumble from a slow, creeping erosion. For Timken, that erosion arrived not with a deafening crash, but with the quiet hum of cargo ships crossing the Pacific. The global landscape was undergoing a seismic shift. Nations that had been devastated by World War II had spent the subsequent decades meticulously rebuilding their manufacturing sectors from the ground up. Japan, in particular, was pioneering the radical new philosophy of industrial production. Unburdened by the massive, aging infrastructure of American legacy companies, Japanese manufacturers like NSK and NTN developed lean, highly efficient supply chains. Furthermore, the European steel industry, heavily subsidized by post-war recovery programs, was suddenly producing high-quality alloys at a fraction of the cost of American mills. Slowly but surely, foreign bearings and cheap imported steel began flooding the United States market. Initially, the executive boardrooms in Canton viewed these overseas competitors with a mixture of skepticism and mild amusement. They believed that no foreign entity could match the legendary durability of a Timken tapered roller bearing or the metallurgical purity of Timken steel. But the market dictates its own ruthless logic. As the 1970s progressed, hampered by global oil crises and severe economic stagflation, major American manufacturers, from automakers in Detroit to heavy machinery builders in Illinois, Iowa, were desperately looking to slash their own production costs. When presented with foreign bearings that were good enough and significantly cheaper, long-standing loyalties evaporated. For the first time in its history, the colossal, vertically integrated machine of Timken found itself outmaneuvered. The very structure that had made Timken a global superpower, its massive, integrated steel-to-bearing pipeline, suddenly transformed from a strategic advantage into a suffocating financial liability. Running a sprawling open-hearth steel mill is an exercise in absolute scale. It only makes economic sense if the furnaces are burning constantly and the output is maximized. When demand for Timken bearings dipped due to foreign undercutting, the steel mills were forced to operate below full capacity. A partially idle steel plant is an industrial black hole, consuming millions of dollars in overhead costs without generating revenue. By the early 1980s, the company's financial statements, once a source of unwavering pride, began flashing alarming red indicators. Profit margins were shrinking. The fortress was hemorrhaging cash. In 1982, as a severe recession battered the American Rust Belt, the reality of the situation became impossible to ignore. The roaring furnaces of Canton, which had burned bright enough to light up the night sky for half a century, were periodically dimmed. Temporary furloughs and layoffs, once an unthinkable concept in the Timken Company town, became a whispered fear in the break rooms and local taverns. The transition was jarring. The men and women who had spent their lives mastering the precise art of shaping metal felt a cold realization creeping in. Their skills, their loyalty, and their generational dedication were no longer enough to insulate them from the ruthless arithmetic of the global market. This mounting financial pressure fundamentally altered the atmosphere inside the Canton facilities. For decades, the relationship between the Timken family management and the blue-collar workforce had been defined by a paternalistic, unspoken social contract. The company provided absolute security, and the workers provided unquestioning loyalty. They were, into the corporate mythology, one big family. But as the executive suite scrambled to stop the financial bleeding, that family dynamic began to fracture. Management brought in efficiency experts and financial consultants who looked at the Canton operations not as a legacy of American triumph, but as a bloated ledger of excessive expenditures. The directives coming down from the top shifted dramatically. The focus moved away from building the most durable product in the world and pivoted sharply toward cost reduction, optimization, and lean manufacturing. Overtime was slashed, benefits were scrutinized. The grueling, physically punishing work of the Higisei of the drop forges and grinding rooms felt exponentially heavier when the promise of absolute job security began to evaporate. The workers of the United Steelworkers Union, many of whom were third-generation Timken employees, felt a deep, unsettling dissonance. They were still pouring the same sweat and risking the same burns on the factory floor, but the company they were bleeding for was changing its fundamental nature. The executives were no longer just industrial engineers. They were being forced to act as financial managers, answering to the increasingly impatient demands of global economics rather than the legacy of Canton. The golden era of mutual trust had ended. The armor of the Timken Empire had suffered its first deep, irreparable cracks, exposing the vulnerable human heart of the company to the incoming storm of globalization. As the calendar flipped to the 1990s, a new, intoxicating religion was sweeping through the executive boardrooms of corporate America. Globalization. The Cold War had ended. Trade barriers were rapidly coming down, and a hyper-connected global economy was emerging. For the leadership at the Timken Company, the brutal financial lessons of the 1980s had forced a radical change in philosophy. They had barely survived the initial flood of cheap Japanese and European imports, and the executives concluded that if they could not beat the foreign competitors from the safety of Ohio, they had to join them on the global stage. The strategy sounded flawless in corporate presentations and annual shareholder reports. To remain the undisputed king of friction management, Timken could no longer afford to be just an American company exporting to the world. It had to become a truly global enterprise. This ideological shift was aggressively accelerated by the signing of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA, in 1994. For the financial architects in Canton, NAFTA was not just a political treaty. It was a green light to fundamentally restructure how and where the company manufactured its products. Suddenly, the towering, expensive infrastructure of the Canton facilities, with its high union wages, legacy pension obligations, and strict environmental regulations, looked less like an integrated fortress and more like an unsustainable financial anchor. Timken began heavily investing capital far beyond the borders of Stark County, Ohio. They opened new manufacturing facilities, acquired existing foreign companies, and established joint ventures in emerging markets where labor was exponentially cheaper. State-of-the-art bearing plants began to spring up in Eastern Europe, India, and eventually the manufacturing juggernaut of China. The executive suite justified this aggressive expansion as a necessary evolution. They argued that by manufacturing closer to their international customers and utilizing lower-cost labor, Timken could preserve its overall corporate health and remain competitive against overseas rivals. On paper, the strategy was a resounding success. Global revenues climbed. The Timken brand expanded its footprint across multiple continents, securing lucrative contracts with international aerospace, automotive, and heavy machinery conglomerates. Wall Street analysts applauded the company's modern, forward-thinking approach, rewarding them with favorable stock ratings. However, a chilling dissonance was beginning to take root back in Ohio. While the executives celebrated record-breaking international growth in the carpeted boardrooms of the corporate headquarters, a very different reality was unfolding just a few miles away on the factory floors. The multi-generational workers of Canton began to notice a terrifying trend. When old machinery broke down, it wasn't always replaced. When a product line was phased out, a new one didn't automatically take its place. Instead, the company was quietly diverting the lifeblood of investment capital away from the very town that had built the empire. The globalization trap had been sprung, and the workers of Canton were the ones caught inside it. The globalization strategy was not limited to crossing oceans. It was also deployed aggressively within the borders of the United States. As the new millennium approached, the Timken Company executed a domestic maneuver that felt like a direct betrayal to the men and women of the Rust Belt. It was known informally across the American manufacturing sector as the Southern Strategy. For decades, the United Steelworkers Union had maintained a powerful, unyielding presence in the Canton plants. The union had successfully negotiated strong wages, comprehensive health care, and guaranteed pensions, the very elements that had created the prosperous local middle class. But in the hyper-competitive era of the 1990s and early 2000s, corporate management viewed these union contracts as a crippling competitive disadvantage. To bypass the union's power, Timken began aggressively expanding its domestic footprint into the American South, specifically into right-to-work states, where labor unions held virtually no political or structural power. Modern, highly automated facilities were constructed in places like North Carolina and South Carolina. These new plants could produce the same world-class tapered roller bearings, but with a non-union workforce that cost the company significantly less in hourly wages and long-term benefits. For the third and fourth generation workers in Canton, the psychological toll of this shift was devastating. The unwritten social contract, the promise that loyalty to the company would be repaid with lifetime security, was systematically shredded in front of their eyes. It is one thing to lose market share to an invisible competitor in a foreign country. It is an entirely different, uniquely bitter pain to clock into a shift, only to watch engineers unbolt a massive, functioning piece of machinery, crate it up in wooden pallets, and ship it to a non-union facility in South Carolina or a new plant in China. The workers were essentially being asked to train their cheaper replacements. The grinding anxiety of job insecurity permeated the Canton facilities. The towering smokestacks of Timken steel still burned, but the soul of the company was fracturing. The executives argued that these harsh measures were the only way to save the core of the business from total annihilation. They pointed to the rising stock price as proof that their ruthless optimization was working. But to the blue-collar families of Ohio, it was clear that a fundamental shift in values had occurred. The Timken Company had optimized its spreadsheets, diversified its global portfolio, and successfully pleased the financial analysts on Wall Street. But in doing so, they had alienated their most fiercely loyal asset, their people. The company had transformed from a family-run institution that cared about the civic health of its hometown into a cold, multinational corporation where human livelihoods were simply line items to be minimized. By prioritizing quarterly earnings over community stability, management had stripped away the mutual trust that had defined Timken for a century. The workers of Canton felt backed into a corner, their generational legacy entirely dismissed by a new breed of financial engineers. The resentment on the factory floor boiled over into outright hostility, setting the stage for a catastrophic internal collision that would permanently scar both the company and the city. As the Timken Company aggressively funneled its capital toward non-union states and overseas markets, a deep, suffocating anxiety settled over the Canton factory floors. The men and women of the United Steelworkers Local 1123, who physically forged the metal and ground the steel, recognized that the ground was rapidly shifting beneath their boots. For nearly a century, contract negotiations in Canton had been grueling, table-pounding affairs. But they were always rooted in a foundational mutual understanding. The company required the workers' unparalleled skill, and the workers required the company's financial security. But by the early 2000s, the atmosphere inside the bargaining rooms had turned remarkably cold and transactional. Corporate management arrived at the negotiating table not with offers of shared prosperity, but with the stark, unyielding spreadsheet of demands. To remain globally competitive and appease the ever-watchful eyes of Wall Street analysts, the executives argued that the company's legacy costs had to be drastically slashed. They placed the sacred pillars of the Canton middle-class dream squarely on the chopping block: comprehensive healthcare benefits, guaranteed pension plans, and standard cost of living wage increases. The executives, speaking the sterile language of modern finance, framed these cuts as unfortunate but absolute economic necessities. To the workers on the floor, it was an unforgivable betrayal. The tension, stretched to its absolute limit, finally snapped. The unspoken social contract that had held the city together for generations ruptured into open conflict. Picket lines formed outside the massive iron gates of the Canton facilities. Men and women whose fathers and grandfathers had bled, sweat, and sometimes died for the company now found themselves standing around burn barrels in the biting Ohio air, holding protest signs directed at the very institution that had built their town. This was not a standard labor dispute over minor hourly discrepancies. It was a desperate, visceral battle for the soul and future of Canton. The workers were fighting to preserve a way of life that had defined the American Rust Belt. They believed that their generational loyalty and their unmatched craftsmanship still held value. But as the strike dragged on, the cold reality of the new global economy began to reveal its face. The executives in the corporate headquarters were no longer looking at their employees as a vital industrial family. They were looking at them as an expensive liability that needed to be mitigated. The Timken company of the 21st century was no longer bound by local sentiment or civic duty. As the picket lines held firm and production stalled, management unleashed a devastating, highly calculated ultimatum. It was a tactic that would forever alter the psychological landscape of the city. The executives delivered a blunt message to the union leadership: accept the steep concessions, or the company would simply close the Canton bearing plants permanently. It was the corporate equivalent of holding a loaded gun to the city's head. Concessions or closure. Management made it explicitly clear that they were fully prepared to unbolt the machinery, pack it onto freight trains, and ship the work to their newly built, non-union facilities in the American South or outsource it entirely to their international plants. The threat was not a bluff. It was a demonstration of absolute leverage. The company had spent the last decade building a global safety net specifically, so they would never again be held hostage by the workers of Ohio. Faced with the terrifying, immediate prospect of total economic ruin and the collapse of their community, the union buckled. They had no other choice. A devastating vote was cast, and the workers were forced to ratify a contract that significantly eroded their wages, slashed their benefits, and offered zero guarantees for long-term job security. When the strike ended, the workers walked back through the factory gates, but the atmosphere inside the plant was unrecognizable. The machinery still roared, the open hearth furnaces still burned bright orange, and the tapered roller bearings still rolled off the assembly line with microscopic precision. But the invisible, unbreakable bond of trust was dead. The paternalistic myth of the Timken family had been shattered entirely. The emotional dissonance on the factory floor was profound. The men and women of Canton realized they were no longer building an empire alongside their employers. They were merely surviving under the thumb of a hostile corporate entity. They had traded away their hard-earned rights just to buy a few more years of employment. The workers had surrendered, but the bleeding was far from over. By breaking the spirit of the union and proving that the legacy of Canton was entirely expendable, management had unwittingly laid out a red carpet for a much more ruthless predator. The company was now a lean, optimized, and emotionally hollow entity, the perfect target for the sharks of Wall Street. By the early 2010s, the dust had seemingly settled in Canton. The brutal concessions forced upon the union a decade prior, combined with an aggressive expansion into global markets, had achieved exactly what management had promised: financial stabilization. In fact, the Timken company was not just surviving, it was generating robust, reliable profits. The furnaces at Timken Steel were burning, the bearing plants were humming, and the balance sheets looked healthier than they had in years. To the casual observer, it appeared that the industrial giant had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of globalization. But in the modern ecosystem of global finance, steady, reliable profit is no longer the ultimate goal. It is merely a baseline. The true currency of the 21st century stock market is exponential growth and maximum shareholder value. While the workers in Ohio were grinding steel and meeting their daily production quotas, a different kind of calculation was taking place inside the glass and steel skyscrapers of Wall Street. A specialized breed of financial entity, known as the activist investor, had fixed its gaze upon Canton. Leading the charge was Relational Investors, a powerful hedge fund, operating in tandem with major institutional shareholders like the California State Teachers Retirement System, CalSTRS. These financial engineers did not build things. They did not understand the intricate metallurgy required to forge a flawless, tapered roller bearing, nor did they care about the century-old symbiotic relationship between a company and its hometown. What they understood was leverage, asset valuation, and the ruthless mathematics of unlocking trapped capital. When the analysts at Relational Investors looked at the Timken company, they did not see a proud, vertically integrated manufacturing dynasty. They saw an inefficient corporate structure suffering from what Wall Street calls a conglomerate discount. The logic was brutally clinical. Timken's century-old strategy of making its own steel to ensure absolute quality control was, in the eyes of the hedge fund, dragging down the company's overall stock price. The steel industry is notoriously volatile, subject to massive swings in global commodity prices, while the engineered bearings market is highly specialized and relatively stable. The activists formulated a simple, devastating thesis. If Timken were to take a chainsaw to its historical foundation and split itself into two completely separate publicly traded companies, one for steel, one for bearings, the combined stock price of the two new entities would instantly surge. It was an exercise in financial alchemy. They were not proposing a new product, a new technological innovation, or a better way to manage friction. They were simply proposing a paperwork maneuver that would magically generate hundreds of millions of dollars in immediate paper wealth for the shareholders. The invasion had officially begun. In 2013, Relational Investors publicly launched an aggressive campaign to force the Timken board of directors to break the company in half. For the multi-generational workforce in Canton, the news was a psychological gut punch. They had already sacrificed their wages, their benefits, and their peace of mind to keep the company whole and competitive. Now they watched helplessly as outside entities, who had never set foot on a factory floor, threatened to tear the legacy apart, simply to bump up the terms of the quarterly dividend. The executive suite in Canton, led by Chairman Ward J. Timken Jr., the great-grandson of the founder, found itself fighting a desperate, multi-front war to save the soul of the company. For the Timken family, the proposed split was not just a bad business strategy, it was an existential threat to everything their ancestors had built. Ward Timken Jr. fiercely defended the integrated model. He argued passionately to the financial press and the shareholders that separating the steel division from the bearing division would destroy the company's unique competitive advantage. The ability to custom forge the exact metallurgical recipe required for a specific aerospace bearing or a massive wind turbine component was the very reason the Timken name commanded global respect. The steel mill wasn't a cumbersome side project. It was the biological heart of the entire operation. To sever it would be to lobotomize the company's engineering supremacy. But the defense, no matter how deeply rooted in industrial truth, fell on deaf ears. The fundamental rules of corporate America had changed. Heritage, craftsmanship, and community loyalty do not get a vote in the boardroom. Only shares do. And the activist investors had amassed enough shares and rallied enough institutional support to turn the boardroom into a hostage situation. The activists launched a relentless proxy war. They released glossy, mathematically dense presentations arguing that the Timken management was entrenched, sentimental, and actively destroying shareholder value by clinging to an outdated business model. They framed the Timken family not as the visionary builders of an American empire, but as stubborn aristocrats standing in the way of modern financial optimization. The pressure on the independent board members became excruciating. Wall Street analysts downgraded the stock, citing management's refusal to unlock value. Financial news networks covered the impending proxy vote like a sporting event, tallying the mounting support for the corporate divorce. The narrative was entirely wrested away from the physical reality of manufacturing and plunged into the sterile, abstract world of capital allocation. For the workers of Canton, watching this corporate battle unfold was an exercise in profound alienation. The fate of their livelihoods, their pensions, and their city was being decided by portfolio managers in New York and California who viewed them merely as operating expenses on a spreadsheet. The workers realized that the ultimate loyalty of a publicly traded company is never to its employees, and certainly never to its history. It is bound by legal fiduciary duty to serve the immediate financial desires of its current shareholders, even if those shareholders just bought the stock a month ago, specifically to force a liquidation. As the annual shareholder meeting approached in 2013, the tension in Ohio reached a suffocating peak. The Timken family and the remaining loyalists in management braced for impact. They had survived 2 world wars, the Great Depression, the influx of cheap foreign steel, and a bitter labor strike. But as the final proxy votes were counted, they realized they were entirely defenseless against the most destructive force of all, the insatiable, frictionless machinery of Wall Street greed. The breaking point arrived not with the deafening roar of a factory explosion, but with the quiet, sterile tallying of proxy ballots. On September 5, 2013, the shareholders of the Timken Company convened to vote on the proposal championed by relational investors and Callis TRS, the complete separation of the steel and bearing divisions. For the activist investors, this was simply a routine unlocking of trapped capital. For the city of Canton and the Timken family, it was a referendum on 115 years of industrial heritage. Despite the impassioned, desperate defense mounted by Chairman Ward J. Timken Jr., the verdict from Wall Street was absolute. The institutional shareholders, driven by the promise of an immediate surge in stock value, voted overwhelmingly in favor of the split. The board of directors, bound by their legal fiduciary duty to maximize shareholder returns, had no choice but to concede. The integrated model, the very engine that had forged the American middle class in Ohio, built the machinery of World War II and maintained an unyielding standard of metallurgical purity for over a century, was officially sentenced to death. The monumental task of uncoupling the 2 interconnected behemoths began immediately, culminating on June 30, 2014. On that day, the Timken Company legally ceased to exist in its historic form. In its place, 2 entirely separate, independent, publicly traded entities were born. The Timken Company, focusing solely on engineered bearings and power transmission, and Timken Steel, focusing on custom alloy steel. On the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, executives rang the opening bell to celebrate the birth of the 2 new ticker symbols, TKR and TMST. Financial analysts applauded the move, and just as the hedge funds had predicted, the combined market capitalization of the 2 new companies surged. It was a flawless victory for financial engineering. But back in Canton, Ohio, there was no ringing of bells. There was only a profound, echoing disorientation. The corporate divorce was a logistical nightmare that defied common sense on the factory floor. For a century, the steel mills and the bearing plants had operated as a single biological organism. The Presidente was The steel produced in the morning was explicitly engineered to be transformed into bearings by the afternoon. The engineers from both divisions shared the same cafeterias, the same databases, and the same overarching mission. Now dictated by reams of legal paperwork, generated hundreds of miles away, they were suddenly forced to operate as entirely separate corporate entities, bound by strict non-disclosure agreements, separate boards of directors, and competing financial priorities. The psychological whiplash was severe. The integrated fortress had been breached from the inside. The executives had successfully appeased the activist investors, but in doing so, they had permanently severed the industrial soul of the company. The men and women who had dedicated their lives to the Timken way realized that the company's legendary self-reliance was gone. The bearings division would now have to buy its steel on the open market, treating its former brother-in-arms simply as another vendor. Timken Steel would have to scramble to find new customers to fill the massive void left by the loss of its guaranteed internal buyer. The frictionless dream that Henry Timken had envisioned in 1899 was finally broken, sacrificed at the altar of quarterly earnings. The translation of Wall Street's paperwork into the physical reality of Canton was a brutal, visible process. The Great Schism did not just alter balance sheets, it altered the very geography of the town. The sprawling industrial campuses that had once been unified under a single banner were suddenly subjected to strict, unnatural borders. Chain-link fences were erected between facilities that had collaborated for decades. All AT systems were severed, preventing engineers from sharing metallurgical data without formal corporate requests. Workers who had spent 30 years carpooling to the same plant suddenly found themselves wearing different colored ID badges, working for completely different companies, and reporting to separate human resources departments. With the shield of the integrated conglomerate stripped away, both new companies were now fully exposed to the ruthless demands of the stock market. To prove to Wall Street that the split was justified, both the Timken Company and Timken Steel immediately embarked on aggressive campaigns to lean out their operations and maximize independent profitability. The efficiencies demanded by the newly formed boards translated directly into the systematic dismantling of the Canton workforce. Corporate restructuring swept through the region like a scythe. Administrative departments, once centralized and robust, were slashed and outsourced to avoid duplication. The Timken Company, now completely unburdened from the massive overhead of the steel mills, accelerated its strategy of global diversification, pouring capital into acquisitions in Europe and Asia, while the legacy bearing plants in Ohio were subjected to further cost-cutting measures. Timken Steel, heavily dependent on the volatile oil and gas sector for its newly independent revenue, was soon battered by plummeting global energy prices. Without the steady, guaranteed income from the bearing division to act as a financial shock absorber, the steel company was forced to initiate waves of devastating layoffs. For the multi-generational steelworkers of Canton, the schism felt like a slow, agonizing betrayal. The older generation, the men who had poured their sweat into the drop forges during the company's golden era, watched in quiet despair as the sprawling footprint of the Canton operation shrank. Entire buildings that once vibrated with the relentless rhythm of production fell silent, their windows darkened, their heavy machinery auctioned off or shipped to non-union states. The social fabric of the city, woven together by a century of Timken's paternalistic care, unraveled completely. The company town was dead. The local taverns, once filled with the lively banter of thousands of off-shift workers discussing their pensions and their children's college funds, grew quiet and empty. The Great Schism of 2014 had achieved exactly what it was designed to do. It unlocked hundreds of millions of dollars in paper wealth for investors who had never set foot in Ohio. But in exchange, it extracted the lifeblood of a community. The empire had not been conquered by a superior product or a foreign competitor. It had simply been dismantled, piece by piece, by the very system it had helped to build. The roar of the integrated machine was gone, leaving behind only the fractured remnants of a once undisputed industrial dynasty. If you drive through the industrial corridors of Canton, Ohio today, you are met with a profound, heavy silence. The skyline is still dominated by the towering, blackened smokestacks and the massive, sprawling brick facades of the manufacturing plants. But the sensory experience, the very heartbeat of the city, has fundamentally changed. For nearly a century, the ground in Canton literally vibrated. The rhythmic, deafening thud of colossal drop forges and the relentless roar of open hearth furnaces were the soundtrack of American prosperity. Today, that thundering percussion has been replaced by the quiet hum of passing traffic and the wind rattling against chain-link fences. These fences are the most visible, physical scars of the 2014 corporate schism. They slice arbitrarily through what was once a unified, integrated industrial empire, separating the engineered bearings facilities from the steel mills. The physical division mirrors the social and economic fracturing of the city itself. Canton is now haunted by the ghost of its own golden age. The sprawling parking lots, which once required dedicated traffic cops to manage the flood of thousands of workers during shift changes, now sit half empty, with weeds pushing up through the cracked asphalt. The human toll of the Timken split and the subsequent years of aggressive corporate optimization is written across the storefronts of the city. The ecosystem of local commerce that thrived on the disposable income of the unionized middle class has slowly withered. The corner diners where third-shift workers used to gather for early morning breakfasts are shuttered. The local taverns, once packed with steel workers debating contract negotiations and celebrating production milestones, have quietly closed their doors. When the high-paying, secure manufacturing jobs vanished, they took the foundational pillars of the local economy with them. The sons and daughters of Canton, whose parents and grandparents had built comfortable, secure lives on the factory floor, are now forced to navigate a fragmented gig economy or leave the region entirely in search of opportunity. But the most bitter, agonizing pill for the people of Canton to swallow is the stark reality of the global financial pages. This is not a story of a company that went bankrupt because it produced an inferior product. It is not the story of a dinosaur that failed to adapt to technological progress. The cruel paradox is that on the global stage, the Timken name is more profitable than ever. Freed from the massive overhead of the integrated steel mills and the legacy costs of its American workforce, the Timken company accelerated into the 21st century as a lean, aggressive, multinational corporation. They expanded their footprint across Europe, India, and Asia, acquiring smaller friction management companies and securing highly lucrative contracts in aerospace, renewable energy, and robotics. Every quarter, the executives report robust margins, and Wall Street analysts issue glowing recommendations for the stock. The financial alchemy demanded by relational investors in 2013 worked exactly as promised. The shareholders unlocked massive, unprecedented wealth. Meanwhile, the other half of the divorced empire, Timken Steel, faced its own brutal reckoning. Stripped of its guaranteed internal customer, the steel division was thrust into the notoriously volatile global commodities market. When the oil and gas industry experienced downturns, Timken Steel absorbed the full, unmitigated impact. Without the stabilizing revenue of the bearings division to offset the losses, the steel mills were forced into cyclical waves of temporary furloughs and permanent layoffs. The workers who remained were asked to do more with less, operating aging machinery under the constant, suffocating threat that the next bad financial quarter could be their last. The fortress of Canton was not just divided. It was conquered by the chaotic whims of global supply and demand. As thus the stock charts climbed upwards for the bearing division, the geographic soul of the company bled out. The activist investors who forced in the Great Schism made their hundreds of millions and quickly moved on to their next corporate target, leaving the city of Canton to manage the devastating collateral damage. The workers realized, with chilling clarity, that the modern megacorporation is entirely untethered from the concept of a hometown. Capital is completely fluid. It flows instantly across international borders to wherever labor is cheapest and regulations are loosest. But the human beings who physically build the empire are stationary. They are anchored to their communities, their homes, and their histories. The older generation of Canton, the retirees who still wear their faded Union jackets and old Timken baseball caps, walk through a city that feels like a museum dedicated to a lost civilization. They possess the muscle memory of shaping the toughest steel on earth, but they are entirely powerless against the invisible, frictionless algorithms of modern finance. They built an institution that helped win global wars and power the American century, only to be told that their loyalty was a financial liability. The ghost of Canton is not just the empty factories or the silent furnaces. The true ghost is the lingering, painful memory of the American dream. The shattered promise that if you worked hard, built the best product in the world, and dedicated your life to a company, that company would take care of you in return. Today, the world still spins on Timken bearings, smoothly and efficiently, but the city that gave birth to them has been left grinding against the harsh, unforgiving gears of extreme capitalism. The corporate entity survived and thrived, but it had to surgically extract its own heart to do so. The autopsy of the Timken Company's integrated empire in Canton, Ohio, offers more than just a cautionary tale about a single corporate restructuring. It serves as a perfect, terrifying microcosm of the fundamental shift in American capitalism during the 21st century. For the first 100 years of its existence, Timken operated under the principles of industrial capitalism. In this traditional system, wealth was generated by creating tangible, lasting value. It was built on the premise of taking raw iron ore, applying human sweat and engineering genius, and transforming it into a physical product that solved a real-world problem. Henry Timken and his descendants did not merely manufacture money. They built the frictionless components that allowed the modern world to move forward. But the Great Schism of 2014 was driven by an entirely different, infinitely more ruthless philosophy: financial capitalism. In this modern arena, the primary objective is no longer to build, invent, or sustain. The goal is simply to extract. Activist investors and hedge fund managers do not construct new factories, nor do they pioneer new metallurgical techniques to advance human progress. Instead, they act as financial surgeons. They identify legacy institutions that have spent a century building immense inherent value, and they systematically carve those institutions up to release short-term capital. It is an economic system that inherently rewards the immediate optimization of a balance sheet over the long-term survival of a community or the preservation of a national industry. Wall Street declared the splitting of Timken an absolute textbook triumph. By the strict clinical metrics of the stock market, they were entirely correct. Shareholder value was successfully unlocked, and dividends were paid out. But this narrow definition of success completely ignores the human balance sheet. When a publicly traded corporation's only legal fiduciary loyalty is to its current shareholders, many of whom are transient algorithmic traders or aggressive hedge funds looking for a quick exit, the workers who physically built the company's legacy are instantly reduced to acceptable casualties. The system is coldly designed to treat human livelihoods, generational loyalty, and civic stability not as assets, but as financial inefficiencies waiting to be eradicated. The profound tragedy of Canton is that its story is not unique. Across the American Rust Belt, this exact same financial playbook has been executed time and time again. Historic giants of manufacturing, the very companies that forged the arsenal of democracy and built the largest, most prosperous middle class in human history, have been systematically dismantled. They have been stripped of their physical assets, severed from the hometowns that birthed them, and their labor outsourced to the lowest global bidder. We have successfully engineered a global economy that is brilliantly efficient at moving capital across digital borders, but fundamentally incapable of sustaining the human communities left in its wake. We have spent over a century perfecting the tapered roller bearing, proudly eliminating the mechanical friction that slows down our physical machines. Yet, in our relentless, unyielding pursuit of maximized quarterly profits, we have created an economic machine that generates massive, devastating social friction. We have optimized our ledgers and enriched our portfolios, but we are slowly bankrupting our industrial soul. The ghost of Canton stands as a silent, towering warning to the future. A nation cannot remain an industrial superpower if its primary economic strategy is to carve up and sell off its own foundation. The story of Canton, Ohio, and the fracturing of the Timken Empire is not just a localized chapter of industrial history. It is a mirror reflecting the current state of our global economy. For over a century, the men and women of this city dedicated their lives and their generational labor to a singular, brilliant purpose: eliminating mechanical friction. They built the exact components that kept the modern world turning. From the earliest assembly lines of Detroit to the most advanced aerospace engineering of the 21st century, they succeeded so completely that their product became the invisible, indispensable backbone of human progress. But in the process, they became the victims of a different, far more destructive kind of friction, one generated not by metal scraping against metal, but by a modern financial system that prioritizes frictionless wealth extraction over long-term human stability. The ultimate tragedy of the Timken schism is that the company didn't fail. It didn't go bankrupt. It didn't lose its technological edge. It was simply carved up because the ecosystem of Wall Street decided that a century of integrated heritage and a thriving, fiercely loyal working-class community were less valuable than a sudden spike in a quarterly dividend. Today, the bearings still roll out to the world, manufactured across a decentralized global network. The stock prices fluctuate, the dividends are paid, and the activist hedge funds continue their relentless search for the next historic legacy to unbundle. But in Canton, the heavy, reassuring heartbeat of the integrated manufacturing machine has been silenced forever. It leaves us with a haunting question for the future of American industry. If the ultimate goal of a corporation is no longer to build a resilient community alongside a superior product, but merely to satisfy the algorithmic demands of a spreadsheet, what exactly are we building toward? Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of America's industrial legacy. If this story resonated with you, or if you have witnessed the impact of corporate restructuring in your own community, please share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss our upcoming documentaries exploring the rise and fall of the unseen empires that built our world.